appreciate it. All right. Next up will be our final panel on anti-racist teaching and practice. It's moderated by Seema Mohapatra, who will introduce our panelists. And Seema is a Murray visiting professor of law at SMU, but is also a professor who will be going on. They've successfully recruited her there to SMU, and I've known her for a very long time and am always very excited to read the scholarship that she produces. And she was just here a couple weeks ago for our Baby Markets Roundtable, so it's great to have you back here and in this very room. So take it away, Seema. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you so much for first of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for sticking around for what's been, after a rich day of presentations. I know you guys are tired, but we appreciate you sticking with us. I wanted to thank Professor Michele Goodwin and Professor Holly Fernandez Lynch for this great volume and conference, and for really creating this space for these important discourse and this conversation. And I so appreciate having a contribution in this volume with Abby Lowe and Kelly Deneen. And I'm so grateful for this invitation to moderate this. All day we've heard sessions focusing on many areas, including public health, education, nutrition, worker policy, nicotine policy, policing, disability, research, law, and how we need to have an anti-racist focus in various ways in all of these areas. And in a way, this panel is kind of a perfect end to this day, because both of the pieces the panelists wrote for this volume focus on anti-racist education in law schools and medical schools. In my own work on structural discrimination in healthcare, I've focused on physician training and diverse medical school recruiting. And I wanted to very briefly frame the importance of the work our panelists have done. We're kind of in a strange moment when it comes to education and racial justice. Unless you've been kind of living under a rock, you know that suddenly many red states like Florida, Texas are obsessed with restricting education about race. And this is not just in K through 12 education. I teach critical race theory in Texas at a private university, SMU. And just a few weeks ago, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas announced that he's going to push to end professor tenure for all new hires at Texas public universities and colleges in an effort to somehow combat indoctrination, is what he calls it, teaching students about critical race theory, and then proposing a change to state law that would make this a grounds for revoking tenure for professors who already have it. At the same time that we have this national uproar about critical race theory, which is really not about critical race theory at all. It's not anything that really politicians care about. It's about fomenting racial panic. We also have some positive moves to actually further anti-racist teaching. The American Bar Association recently adopted a requirement that law schools educate students about bias, racism, cross-cultural competency. That was spurred on by 75% of the law deans in the American law schools asking the ABA to actually enact this kind of change in June 2020. So in February 2020, the ABA House of Delegates actually approved these changes to law school accreditation standards. And given that law students have a unique role in kind of shaping future law and policy, it's important that all law students kind of learn about structural racism. Additionally, this whole conference today has been about health and health law. We know we have a need to have physicians who understand health inequities and the impact of societal factors like racism, particularly in light of police violence against Black people, which Professor Goodwin started off the day talking about, and the disparate impact of COVID-19 on Black and Brown communities. We have worrying statistics, and I'm sure all of you know, I'm not going to repeat them, in terms of the racial disparities in COVID. And medical schools have not focused on teaching about biases, social determinants of health, structural discrimination, we know that medical care is only one part of health. Social determinants of health affect much more. And it's important that future doctors learn about disparities that cause differences in the social determinants of health in more than just a passing module. One study of 49 American law schools showed that including a curriculum on minority communities actually increased medical students' intentions to serve those communities. So how do we increase anti-racist education in medical and law schools? And that's what our panelists are going to be discussing today. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction of our panelists. In the interest of time, I've shortened their illustrious bios. I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk to them. And so I'm going to start with Medha Makhlouf, is an assistant professor and founding director of the Medical Legal Partnership Clinic at Penn State Dickinson Law. She also holds a courtesy appointment at Penn State College of Medicine in the Department of Public Health Sciences. And her research and teaching interests lie in the intersection of health law, immigrant rights, and poverty law and policy. And she's going to be talking about the medical legal partnership that she has worked to create. And she was honored in 2020 as a Penn State Dickinson Law Faculty of the Year and named a senior fellow in the Atlantic Fellows for Health Equity program. And then we have Kate Mitchell, who is a clinical professor and director of the Health Justice Project Clinic, which is a medical legal partnership at Loyola University, Chicago School of Law. She also holds a joint appointment in family medicine at Loyola Strike School of Medicine. And she has extensive experience representing children and families in access to healthcare and public benefits, education, immigration, and other general civil law matters. And Kate and I actually were in the same class at Northwestern together. Same small section too. Yes, and it was just, a couple years ago. And our last panelist is joining us via Zoom, Jessica Simpson, who's a third-year medical student at Loyola University, Chicago Strike School of Medicine. And she's the founder and former president of White Coats for Black Lives, the chapter at her medical school. And she's the former vice president of the Integrative Medical Student Interest Group. Prior to medical school, Ms. Simpson worked at the CDC for 5 years in HIV-related surveillance, national survey analysis, and the opioid epidemic, including working abroad in Sierra Leone for the CDC. And she has, for a medical student, she already has more than 10 peer-reviewed publications, including one in this volume. And we are very excited to welcome her. And the two articles in this volume by the panelists are: first, an interprofessional anti-racist curriculum is paramount to addressing racial health inequities. And that's by Kate Mitchell, Jessica Simpson, Maya Watson, and Abigail Silva. And then Towards Racial Justice, the Role of Medical Legal Partnerships by Medha Makhlouf. And so to start our discussion, I wanted to give you guys each about 5 minutes to discuss your contributions to this anti-racist volume. And in case people haven't read it yet, we want to spend most of the time in discussion, but I wanted to give you some time to frame it. And so Professor Mitchell, if you want to start and talk about the paper's main claim, you're welcome to stand here or sit there, and then I'll.
Okay, is this working? Okay, great. Well, first of all, I'm so honored to be here and to have heard all of the colleagues who've given such amazing presentations throughout the day. And I really want to, appreciate my co-authors, Jessica, who's here, but our other co-authors, Maya Watson, who is a clinical teaching fellow at Loyola Law School, and Abigail Silva, who teaches in the Parkinson School of Public Health. It was a collaborative effort writing this. I just was the person who could come and be here in person for a variety of reasons. But our article discusses our belief that law schools, medical schools, and schools of public health need to teach about the racist histories of our professions and how complicit we were collaboratively in creating systems that perpetuate health inequities and disparities. And we also argue that our professions need to teach students, future professionals, anti-racist strategies in a collaborative and interprofessional ways so that we can learn to work together, to understand, as the first panel discussed, our histories deeply, but also learn to collaborate in how to address the systems that our professions have put in place but need to be restructured or dismantled to create opportunities for health equity. And we also further argue that these opportunities that are offered need to be experiential. So as a clinical professor, I feel really strongly that students need to have active, practical experiences doing this work. And we're arguing that we need interprofessional experiential opportunities for students in medicine, public health, and law to understand our history and structural racism and how it's impacted health, but also learn to do something about it together. So we talk a little bit in our article about some of the things we've done through creating some interprofessional experiential courses and volunteer opportunities, what we do in the Health Justice Project Clinic to provide these opportunities. And we have social work interns and medical students who participate in our clinic and work on teams with law students. And our article also talks about volunteer work and some of the work that Jessica and other medical students have done at Loyola, doing advocacy in communities. So that is what we are calling for. And I'll answer questions very soon. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So Medha, do you want to give a little overview of your article as well?
Sure, I'm happy to do so. I'm really pleased to be with you all today on the last panel of the day. Thank you so much, Holly and Michele, for inviting me, and Mary and everybody else who had a role in putting together this symposium today. Being on the last panel of the day for me is both intimidating and wonderful. It's intimidating because it's hard to follow all of the terrific presentations we've already seen, but I also see that there is an opportunity to contribute to the conversation by integrating some of what we've heard throughout the day. So I will try to do that in my presentation of my article and my responses to the questions. So I think most people here are probably familiar with medical legal partnerships, but just in case, I did want to explain what they are, or my view of what they are. So from my perspective, medical legal partnerships, or MLPs, are a platform for collaboration between legal and healthcare professionals for the benefit of patients who have health-harming legal needs and who don't have the resources to resolve them on their own. So we've been talking all day about the links between law, health, and racism, and MLP is one example of how law can be used as a tool to improve health and potentially to address racial health disparities. Specifically, MLPs address unmet civil legal needs that are barriers to good health. So some of you probably have heard of the MLP acronym IHELP. It stands for, or it describes the different legal domains that MLPs typically address. So the I stands for income and insurance, H stands for housing, E stands for education and employment, L stands for legal status, and P stands for personal stability, personal and community stability. And I think there are some other versions of that as well, but that's sort of the basic overview of the types of issues that MLPs typically address. Note that all of those IHELP domains are shaped by structural discrimination, things like poverty and racism. So the problem that I identify in my article is that medical legal partnership is typically and historically framed as a poverty-focused health equity intervention without explicit mention of the role of racism. And that, I believe, has influenced the strategies that MLPs around the country have adopted in their day-to-day work. In other words, MLPs employ legal interventions to address the effects of racism as a social determinant of health, but do not generally acknowledge the anti-racist nature of this work or adopt explicitly anti-racist missions to address institutional and structural racism as root causes of poor health. Now, this is a generalization. There are obvious exceptions, including the Health Justice Project at Loyola, but I had a hunch based on 12 years of working in MLPs in various contexts, that most MLPs do not frame their work as anti-racist. And a survey of more than 200 MLP mission statements on their websites ultimately supported that hunch. So I want to be clear that this article is styled as a self-critique. I am very much a part of the MLP community and don't proclaim to know the role that MLPs can or should play in advancing racial justice, but I'm trying to dip a toe in the conversation by suggesting that the reason that there hasn't been more focus on racism as a social determinant of health in the MLP community is that the original conception of MLPs was colorblind. And the problem with that is we're missing out on our full potential to advance health equity through MLPs. So I propose in the paper that an intersectional racial justice lens, rather than a singular poverty lens, can help MLPs reach their full potential. And the first step I suggest is to say racism, right? So explicitly acknowledge structural racism as a driver of poor health, which does not appear to be the majority practice among MLPs based on the survey of their websites. Second, I suggest that MLP practitioners should do some self-examination of their own institutions to understand what assumptions about race have been formative, much as I've tried to do with the MLP movement as a whole in this article. Finally, I wanted to note that although my comments are very MLP focused, and this panel is very MLP focused, I think that they can apply to other kinds of collaborations in health law, especially interdisciplinary collaborations, as we think about how to shift toward an anti-racist orientation. And to close, I'd just like to share a teaching from Dr. Nosa Orabaton of the Gates Foundation, who I had the pleasure to meet last month. So if you'll just indulge me. This is a direct quote. Health equity is like building an elaborate cathedral over 1,000 years. And your life's work is to build one walkway of that cathedral. You don't have to know what the whole cathedral will look like or how the rest of the construction will go. You just need to be able to envision the walkway, how it contributes to the structure of the cathedral, and how you will build the walkway. So I think altogether that we've created at least a foundation for one walkway in that cathedral. And I think of this article as my very narrow plank in that walkway.
Thank you. That's very beautiful and great quote. I want to engage Ms. Simpson here, and I know I'm gonna ask questions to all the panelists, but I wanted to kind of get your perspective as a medical student. What kinds of experiences have you had as a medical student related to your article that were the most impactful? And, you know, what can we learn about it for other medical schools?
Sure. I'm also very thankful for this opportunity, and I apologize that I could not attend in person, and I'm very gracious for the opportunity to attend virtually. I think, you know, as a medical student, especially as a Black medical student, as a female, and as an older student, my experience at medical school is definitely unique, but I don't think it's unique in the aspect of being a Black person in medical school. We do not discuss the history of the Tuskegee experiment when we're discussing the pathology of syphilis and how we have determined said pathology and how we know so much about that. And it makes us students, not only Black students, but all students, uncomfortable because we do know about that history and yet it's not discussed in our medical school. So unfortunately, our paper, you know, we had a very limited number of words that we could include. So we focused more on the founding of White Coats for Black Lives chapter at my medical school, which was very important because during that time, we all remembered the national cry for Black Lives Matter. And we wanted to address that, especially because in Maywood, it's a predominantly Black neighborhood where there are high rates of morbidity and mortality. And so if we're going to volunteer as medical students, which we love to do in our community, but not show our love and appreciation for the Black community, we felt that that was wrong. And so I asked my classmates if they would be willing to hold up a sign that says White Coats for Black Lives. And over almost 300 students decided to participate in that, which was astounding. And because of that, I started the White Coats for Black Lives chapter at my school. I later found out that a hospital that's located in the south side of Chicago, it's a safety net hospital, which I'm sure most of you all are familiar with the term safety net. Like many other safety net hospitals, it was on the verge of closing because of not having enough funding and not making, basically not being profitable, unfortunately. And so that hospital was on the verge of closing. The owner is also an owner of Loyola Hospital. And I felt that it was important that we advocate for that hospital to stay open so that way people in the South Side, mainly Asian and Black people, would still have access to health care. And fortunately, with calls to the governor and marching with other physicians and residents and other medical students within the Chicago area, we were able to advocate for that hospital throughout the summer, fall, and spring, and it is currently open. It was sold to some other buyer, so that's great. That's wonderful. I think it shows the importance that medical students and physicians and honestly anyone in the profession has in order, if they want to use their voice to make real, impactful, meaningful change right in that moment. Right, we were able to help all of the people that live in that community to still be able to walk to the hospital because we know that access to care is also a determinant of health. And so I also think it's incredibly important that we talk about racism as a social determinant of health. I think from my experience with working in the government and prior to coming into medical school, it always seems that no one is willing to actively talk about racism, but we've seen from COVID and the effects of that we can no longer remain silent. We need to talk about racism. We need to talk about the history. And I think understanding the history will help us to understand why we are in the situation that we are in today and why the life expectancy, unfortunately for Black Americans, has lost 6 years as opposed to 4 years prior to the COVID pandemic.
Great, thank you so much for that. Let me go to Professor Mitchell. I wanted to ask you about what kinds of experiential opportunities, you had referred to them in your comments. What do you think are kind of a key component for preparing the next generation of professionals, whether they be legal, medical, social work, in order to actually change these kinds of systems and kind of work for health equity?
I can dig into that a little bit more. I mean, I think there are a lot of different options. I think there's a range of options for experiential opportunities. We've created a couple of different versions. One, as we talk about in our paper, is a class that we're calling Health Justice Lab. The last 2 years, that class has focused on race and health equity. There have been prior iterations of it. And in that class, we had students from public health and law and MPH, MD students enrolled, and we explored the history of racism in our healthcare system and in our society more broadly. We looked at, structural determinants of health and racism as a determinant of health in that class. But we also engaged students in interprofessional teams in learning to do something about it. So interprofessional student teams were matched with a community leader in one of the organizations that we were working with, and they all surround the health science campus. For Loyola, as Jessica already mentioned, that campus is located in Maywood, Illinois, and is a predominantly Black community, and the next population that has the highest population of Maywood is Latinx or Hispanic. The other surrounding communities around Maywood are predominantly Latinx and Hispanic. And we had done a lot of community outreach in these communities that were disproportionately impacted by COVID as part of an initiative called the COVID Equity Response Collaborative, which was an interprofessional effort to provide resources and supports and education in these communities that were really hard hit and also very underserved by the Cook County Department of Public Health and by the state. And I'm just giving that framework because we had made a lot of contacts in these communities and were able to match our student teams with community leaders to work on an advocacy project with those leaders. And that was really important component of this class because you can, I think it was Rafiq who talked about this earlier today, but he's not here anymore. You can learn sort of academically what's going on in a community. You can read about structural determinants of health. You can read about how, racism has impacted a community and the availability of resources and lack of resources. But to be like in that community, to be working with community members is a whole different experience altogether. One of my heroes, Brian Stevenson, talks about proximity. I think that's so important. I think that's so important for students who are going to be future professionals in health law to have that proximity. And it really had a huge impact on these students. So they were academically studying the communities that they were serving, looking at issues like redlining, white flight, how that impacted these communities. But then they were talking to leaders about actual current day issues happening in these communities and working with them on a solution, which really gave a different lens through which to see the issues and help them learn practical ways to address it. It also had another effect, which is that it taught the students that there are real leaders and experts in communities and assets in communities that may be struggling, that we can empower and support, and that we don't need to come in and save communities. And I think that was a really important lesson because the community partners that they worked with were amazing, incredible people who are committed to different populations that they were working with in their communities. And that was important, I think, for our students to learn and to become, really community centered and empowering. And so that's one example. Also through the Health Justice Project Clinic, and clinics are a great opportunity for this, and medical legal partnerships in particular are a great opportunity for this interprofessional exposure to the intersection of health and poverty and race. As Medha suggested, we get referrals from healthcare providers, and we provide, direct and systemic advocacy support to individual patients and communities who are experiencing health harming legal needs. But, through that work, students are, again, our class teaches about structural determinants of health, but through the actual representation of clients and people who are living in communities and have been affected by structural determinants of health, that allows students to see these situations through a whole nother lens. So, for example, we do a lot of work in the Social Security disability benefits realm, and the vast majority of our clients are Latinx and Hispanic or Black. Many are immigrants or live in households with mixed status family members. And as students are representing some of these individual clients and understanding the history that's impacted them and brought them to the situation that they're in, they also start to question structures and systems. Is the Social Security Administration system set up to really benefit people with disabilities? Is it set up to do the opposite of that? And so learning that those structural systems, academically, it allows them to make those links with their clients. We have the students in our clinic also study a community and look at the structural determinants of health in the community where one of their clients lives. And the Chicago Department of Public Health has a great resource that allows you to do this. So you can look at access to healthcare, access to grocery stores, other determinants of health in a particular community. And so students are able to sort of like do that background research and understand the context in which their client lives, which helps to sort of address this issue that people who are in poverty, people who are experiencing health-related challenges or disabilities have been affected by personal choice, and allows them to see that there are like many other factors that go into situations and choices. And I could go on and on, but I will stop. I think there are lots of other opportunities and ways to do it, but I think, experiential classes and clinical opportunities are definitely two ways that I would promote.
Great, thank you. And Ms. Simpson, I wanted to give you the opportunity before I go to Professor Makhlouf, if you want to talk about kind of your student perspective on the experiences you've had, especially working interprofessionally.
Yeah, it's important because, like Kate, there's learned from already in the community leaders, and even with helping to save Mercy Hospital, keep the doors open, we were standing behind the community. Our role was to be support and them and helping to amplify their voices, to take over, or to save, things like that, because it's really just to be supported. I think it's been learned too a little bit more about,
Jessica, I'm gonna just have you pause for a second because I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. Oh, if you want to take off your Bluetooth headphones, because that might be why. Oh, does that work?
Is that better now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's just I heard an ambulance outside and I wasn't sure if you guys could hear that, so that's why I put on my Bluetooth. But what I was basically just saying is that, Kate's absolutely right as far as us learning a lot from the people who are already in the community, especially community leaders. And I think our role is never to go in and to take over, but to be supportive and to amplify and to advocate, right? So learning more about advocacy and different ways in which you can do that as a future physician and currently as a medical student. So I never really knew about, making calls to officials and like the governor and all of those things, but also about MLPs. I never even knew what an MLP was until I got connected to Kate. And I think it's really important for medical students to start learning about those things now, because we're always in the back of our mind, especially at Stritch, which is a very service-oriented medical school. We're always thinking about how we can, advocate for our patients in the future. And it's to know that you can work with someone who's already a proficient in the law, and then also like a social worker to help address the other determinants of health for your patient, in addition to doing your own internal work, right? Because we all have bias and things of that nature. I think it just helped to open up my eyes to different other opportunities. And I'm really glad that we have an MLP program at our medical school. It is hard to incorporate into the curriculum because it's very jam-packed, as you can imagine. But I think it's a wonderful opportunity for fourth-year medical students who have a little bit more free time.
Great, thank you. And this transitions really well to Professor Makhlouf. I wanted to ask you, you focused a lot on MLPs, both in your practice and in your professional or your academic work. I just wanted to kind of give you some time to explain why you think those are so important and why you focused on MLPs in particular.
Thank you. Yes, so I've been involved with MLPs for more than a decade in very different contexts. So first as a corporate associate, corporate law firm associate as part of a pro bono program, and then as a legal aid attorney directing a medical legal partnership, and then now for the past 6 or so years in academia. And when I first learned about the medical legal partnership model, I was enchanted, absolutely enchanted by this idea of healthcare and legal professionals breaking down silos to bring their unique skills together to achieve concrete results for patients. And this model continues to excite me. And so I want to be involved with the evolution of it. And so this is why I focused on MLPs. In terms of the precise subject, in terms of why I wanted to research this question of how MLPs actually frame their work, this is an ongoing inquiry for me. In practicing in MLPs in various contexts, I noticed, especially in the first two, the private law setting and then in legal aid, I noticed that the vast majority of our clients were people of color, but it wasn't addressed explicitly. And I wanted to understand why. I wondered what might change in MLP practice if we begin to conceive of our work as anti-racist, right? I wanted to understand through this piece, how the existence of racism played a role, if any, in the development of the MLP concept. The National Center for MLP's mission, the National Center is kind of an umbrella organization for MLPs, and if it shaped how individual MLPs actually operate. And given that we're living in this time where many institutions are doing their own self-examination, I thought that there would be an opportunity to re-examine how MLPs think about their work from an anti-racist perspective.
Great, thank you. And I just thought we have 10 minutes left. So I want to make sure we have time for questions. But before we go to questions, I just want to give you guys each like a minute if you want to talk about what your future projects are related to this area or next steps, if you want to, and then before we go to questions. So.
A minute or well, so a couple of things that we're doing. I talked about the COVID Equity Response Collaborative that we created. And this was an interprofessional project created by students and faculty from the School of Medicine, Public Health, Nursing, and the School of Law. And our future goals for that collaborative is to transition from a COVID focus and become the Community Equity Response Collaborative. And our dream and goal is to create a community-based center in Maywood where our health science campus is located, and work to create more healthcare access. We're working with the mayor of Maywood to explore the possibility of opening an FQHC. We're looking at other ways to do community-centered health equity work going forward. Because we understand that though the community was very hard hit by COVID, there are a lot of like structural historical reasons that happened, and we need to be in a position to address that and incorporate our students in addressing that and learning interprofessionally how to be engaged in that work in that community. So that's one future goal. That's great.
Yeah, and for me, I personally am very interested in eliminating racism in medicine. I know that that's going to take quite some time, especially after being on many meetings with the deans of education and the dean of my school and the president of my school as well. And so I'm focusing on developing an anti-racist curriculum and looking more into exactly what that looks like, making a syllabus and finding resources, and also advocating to the License Committee on Medical Education, the LCME, because currently our accreditation for medical schools does not address anti-racism. We have diversity requirements, and those requirements are also focused on pipeline programs. But as a medical student, I can tell you that that's not enough, right? Not only do we need to have more people of color and more Black physicians, because currently there's less than 2% of physicians are Black, but we also need to address the current people who are practicing both as medical students and residents, and educate them on how medicine and law has been complicit, as we talked about in our paper, in racist practices. So that's what I'm focusing on, and also expanding white coats for Black lives, because I think it's really important.
Great, thank you. Medha.
Oh, thank you. I have a couple of ideas for what comes next after this article. So first, when it comes to an agenda for research, I think that what I like to think of as part 2 of this article, which I've started researching, is to start describing potential frameworks for theorizing racial justice approaches in medical legal partnerships and provide examples of how to operationalize those approaches. So I'll probably be reaching out to Kate and Jessica and to fill in those examples as well. And then I think that a lot of the conversations around incorporating anti-racist approaches in MLPs is happening in the academic MLPs, in part because we have the luxury of, compared with legal aid attorneys, to really sit back and think about, how can we, what are these different theoretical frameworks that would apply? How can we incorporate them? And so gathering, academic MLPs together, holding convening so that we can share ideas and generate momentum on this issue so it doesn't get lost. And then finally, reaching out to non-academic MLPs, because so many of the websites that I surveyed, and two of my students did a vast majority of that work, surveying websites, found that most MLPs are actually based at legal aid practices and other community organizations. So making sure that they are part of this conversation as well.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to see if we had any questions here or online. Jasmine? Here, then there.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time and your impactful presentations. I think education is paramount. My name is Paige and I'm a staff attorney at the Education Law Center. I was interested in your insights about sustainability, because awareness is one thing, but then supporting providers that are serving communities that look like them is another. And I was interested to see if you had any ideas for how to increase sustainability.
I think one way is, requirements. So, in education of professionals, as Seema mentioned, the ABA has recently adopted requirements that we incorporate anti-racism, anti-bias education into the law school curriculum. Jessica is going to make sure that happens in medical school. I think mandates are one thing. Although I'm not 100% sure you're talking only about like professional schools and sustainability. You're talking about post school, like when you're in practice too. Yeah. So I think, that's a tough one, because as we've seen in some research, and I'm thinking about Dana Bowen Matthews' book, she talks about, like, even if you have this training, you go out into practice and your mentors are not like modeling that behavior, like the anti-bias behaviors, you may not be able to sustain them as much. So I think that for me, some really important things are like finding mentors who will continue to support your work. And then I also think, when you get in a position where you can sort of push back against folks who are running the show to sort of like force them to make changes, I think that that's a piece of it. And then I think, my hope is that, students like Jessica and other students that I teach, the future generation of professionals is going to do a much better job. So I think some is going to just come through attrition. But I think just finding people who support you. So even if you're in an institution where that, anti-racist work is not supported or encouraged, like finding other people who will support you in that work can help you to sustain your internal drive.
Thank you. I think we have time for one question.
Okay, I'll make it fast. So you talked a lot about the utility of experiential education, and I thought about how do we get that across the curriculum? And so I'm thinking about law schools in particular, and moves to incorporate an anti-racist lens, a disability justice lens in the first year curriculum, for example. And I could imagine the tenets of what you do every day being infused in some of those courses. And I wondered if you had thought about some of that, if you know people who are working on that. Talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. That's a wonderful idea. I think that it would be terrific to incorporate these sorts of concepts across the curriculum. My dean, Danielle Conway, Dean of Penn State Dickinson Law, is very much involved. We recently established an anti-racist development institute at our law school, which is looking at exactly this, how to incorporate anti-racist concepts across the curriculum. And so it goes beyond health law and sort of critical theories within the health law space, but that, you know, it's a very exciting development. And so I'm hoping to collaborate with them on this as well.
Great.
Holly, did you have a question from our
There's
queue?
no questions online, no.
Okay. All right, everybody join me in a round.
Fantastic. I'm Steve Joffee. I'm interim chair of the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy here, faculty member at the medical school. And as one of the sort of co-hosting departments of this seminar and this symposium, there are so many people and groups I want to thank. I want to thank Ted Hutchinson on behalf of the ASLME for being the host of the special issue and co-hosting the symposium. I want to thank Mary Pham, Emily Walters, Carla Miller, and Carolyn Olson for the superb staff support that they have provided in putting this together. I want to thank everybody who contributed to the volume, who spoke today, who moderated today. It was a phenomenal set of panels and discussions, and all of you who came and who participated in the discussions. And I especially want to thank Michele Bratcher Goodwin and Holly Fernandez Lynch for being the sort of intellectual architects and driving forces and motivating people behind this really wonderful project. So thanks to everybody who has made this happen. Just want to share a couple of thoughts before turning it over to close. A couple of years ago, I was watching online a talk that Dana Bowen-Matthew, whose name was just mentioned, was given on structural racism. And she argued, and I learned from this, that her argument was that the foundations of this, that structure really meant law, that the foundations of structural recommendation was like the laws and regulations that underpinned it and had, sort of decades and centuries of historical roots. And if you bring that over to health and healthcare, we're really talking about health law as a sort of fundamental tool in understanding structural racism in health and tackling it. Now, it's not only health law; it's also economic laws, at least to the economy and to labor and education laws. Professor Gonzalez reminded us earlier, and anti-discrimination law and environmental law and all kinds of other laws. All of that have impact on health laws. Are obviously a really important tool. It's the foundation of the institutions through which structural racism and its effects on health are expressed. So we need scholarship, we need health lawyers, we need people who work in health law policy to help us tackle the challenge. This was sort of brought home to me. I'll just tell you a quick story. As a physician and bioethicist at Penn, I was called into many panels and committees to help sort of think through some of the challenges of COVID. Holly Fernandez Lynch was a real partner in that. We were on many committees together. And as will come as no surprise that COVID was a sort of disaster across our community, and people from all walks of life came into our clinics and emergency room really sick with COVID, but it was disproportionately people of color and people who were poor and people who were working in these quote essential worker jobs, which is a term that I really dislike. And it was structural factors that put the people who disproportionately came through the doors of the emergency room at risk for going on to develop serious illness. In addition to the comorbidities that put them more at risk of getting really sick, it was these structural factors that put them at risk of just sort of catching the illness in the first place. And in our efforts to redress that, you remember that many of the things that we had to offer patients were in shortage, right? I'll take remdesivir, one of the early drugs, as an example. There was not enough remdesivir to go around. And so the question was, who got it? And so one of the committees that we were on was a committee to say, we don't have enough to go around, so how are we going to ration the remdesivir that we have? And so Holly and I and many others sort of helped think this through. And we were using a lottery, right? Sort of a, flip of the coin or a lottery system, but also a lottery that we wanted to use to kind of redress some of the inequities that made some people more at risk of walking in the door really sick in the first place. So the lottery system meant that you got some extra points for living in a socially disadvantaged area, which was a proxy for race and poverty and a bunch of other things. Extra points for being an essential worker within a defined set of categories. And these were rules that were sort of laid out across the state and across many places in the country. But this was an effort to redress, to sort of remediate these like way upstream issues that were making people disproportionately walk through the door or be carried through the door, or be wheeled through the door in the first place. So it felt like a kind of remedial anti-racist step, which like is, okay, great, that's important, but that's not the main thing, right? So the real issues are way upstream, and the need to, the importance of addressing the institutional race, it is important to address institutional racism and to tackle institutional racism in healthcare. All of the things that happen in healthcare and the way we deliver care and who we deliver care to and who has access to care. Like that's part of the battle. It might get us, I don't know, 20, 30% of the way there, 10% of the way there, but it's not the main issue. The main issue is all of these upstream things that put some people at much more risk because of the circumstances of their lives and their communities and the challenges that they and their communities and their families have faced. So I guess my message is health law and structural racism is about healthcare, and we talked about healthcare to a large extent today, but it's also about all of these upstream things that happen way before people come into the hospital system, come into the clinic, come into the doctor's office. And so that's going to be a big part of our job, is tackling all of these upstream things, even things that don't sort of seem like health in the first place. Again, your point about education or the point about environmental stuff, like all of that has impacts on health. Health is a measure of the equity or inequity, the success or failure in tackling those things. So sort of the CDC has a policy, although I'm not sure that they really live this, but if you go to their website, you can find the sort of discussion of health in all things. And I would argue we ought to be thinking not only about health in all things, health in all policies, but health equity in all policies. So I will leave you with that. I will turn it over to Michele for the penultimate words of wisdom, and then we will be closing soon. Let me say, as Michele comes up also, for those of you who are the speakers and panelists who are joining for Houston Hall, I will be happy to sort of walk you over there as your local tour guide for those of you who might have trouble finding it otherwise. So meet me with my umbrella after the session.
I know at the end of the day, of long conference, the last thing that you want is a lengthy closing. So this won't be lengthy, but I hope you'll hear me out. Thank you so much, Steve, for helping us and supporting from the very beginning our effort to pull this together. Ted, thank you so much for making sure that at this conference we could have out the publication, which is a huge deal. Thank you, Ted. You pushed and made that happen. And I also want to thank Professor Christopher, you as well, and your center for supporting our event today and for you being here the entirety of the day to support our efforts. Thank you so much. And to my colleague, Holly, Professor Holly Fernandez Lynch, thank you so much for our meetings. There were many meetings that went into this, and this has been an effort that has been more than a year in coming. So thank you, Holly and Mary and the staff here. So colleagues, it's been an honor to be with you today. In 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. informed a group of reporters in Wisconsin that he refused to segregate his moral concerns. At the time, he was questioned why he had become concerned with socioeconomic inequality, women's rights, and the war in Vietnam. Reporters were mystified as this did not fit with their vision of him or civil rights. And Dr. King responded, "I refuse to segregate my moral concerns." As a researcher and scholar, I too have refused to segregate my moral concerns, and so have you. Today, as we bring the symposium to a close, I also bring to a close my 2022 Provost Distinguished Visiting Faculty Fellow Stay. It's a lot of words in there here at Penn. And I'm grateful for this honor, and let me tell you why. Despite an upbringing in Manhattan with elite private schools, I am also the granddaughter of the American South. My work reflects not only professional commitments and achievements, but to be candid, your talks today are also personal to me. During the summers to the American South, I was offered a child's eye view of the Underground Railroad starting in Memphis and leading to Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas. My time spent in Mississippi was like stepping into another country, a type of nation where people would understandably flee. My maternal grandparents were survivors. They had been denied voting rights, subjected to sundown laws, refused basic services and accommodations, denied the comfort of publicly funded swimming pools and access to parks. Some of you will reflect on this in documentaries like Eyes on the Prize or films like In the Heat of the Night and Mississippi Burning. The latter was based on the murders of James Chaney, Mickey Schwerner, and Andrew Goodwin, three young men the ages of our undergraduate students at Penn, who were murdered in Neshoba County, Mississippi in 1964, 6 years before I was born. Even in the 1970s, when I was a child, my great-grandfather still lacked plumbing, running water, and basic utilities. I bristle today at my naive desire during those childhood visits to drink water that wasn't clouded and brown. I can still recall the kindness on my aunts and uncles' faces because this thing, clear water, which I asked for, was what they were fighting for, but not part of their lived reality. Even upon his death at 94, my great-grandfather had never been able to drink water from his own tap. Yet it is this legacy that taught me so much about what we value in this symposium: vigilance in the pursuit of higher ideals, intellectual rigor, and shining a light, fiat lux. In hindsight, those summers were an open door to questioning, probing, and problem solving a broader set of phenomenon at the intersections of law, which we've just heard about. Very often, the foundations of the problems we're trying to resolve were based in law themselves. And I will share with you very briefly what I learned from those summers that came to resonate with me as a student and later as a young professor and a scholar, and that actually resonate today, and I think that resonate with you. I understood from those summer visits, the urgency of Black migration northward, and with it, why refugees choose to flee unjust, dangerous places to find sanctuary and safety, which says a lot too about immigration policies, and the tenuous nature of the places wherein they land. I learned not only about racial inequality, but also socioeconomic inequality, and that sex inequality is hand in hand with racial inequality, and that the very communities and societies that made it difficult for women to advance doubled down and made it virtually impossible to live as an open LGBT person, and these matters compound when having a disability. I came to see and recognize, and so have you, how unjust societies inevitably break people, especially targeting Black and Brown people and historically Indigenous people and Asian people in our country. And broken criminal justice systems, which we heard about today, are hungry to chew up and spit out those who lose hope. And in my work as a constitutional law scholar and bioethicist, it is not lost on me the inequities in healthcare and medical research, which situate all of the papers today in various ways. As I started off today, COVID has revealed underlying institutional and infrastructural inequalities and inequities in our society. And the conditions of so many of these legacies of the formerly enslaved were not born out of thin air. Rather, these were the structural conditions often legislated and with the support of local courts and magistrates. These inequalities were visible, and some of the legacies of American human kidnap, traffic, and slavery remain even after emancipation. So let me turn again to the Latin fiat lux, which means to shine a light. I thank you for helping me and Professor Fernandez Lynch to shine a light today. And I wish you all safe travels back home. And thank you all online who are with us today. Thank you. And with that, I think that we can prepare for the umbrella and to begin to make our way over to the restaurant. Okay.